What a great talk. Why is my mic not on? Oh, what a great talk. What a great talk. No, it's on. It's totally on. Yeah. The guy was like, hey, turn it on. Thank you, David. Such a great talk. Goodbye. Who's going to use use effect more nowadays? Yeah, nobody. That's right. No, man. Code of conduct. Anyway, no. I like that talk because I also had a million use states before. And then after being friends with David for a while, you switched to use reducer and it's like gone. I'm also interested in server-side state, by the way. There's a talk coming up. But before that, it's now time for the best talk of the conference. And some of you didn't get that. It's totally fine. His name is Best. You know? Yeah, thanks. One guy, he's like, oh, that's funny. No, but like, I mean, how cool. I mean, sure, it's a joke that maybe has been made a million times, right? He's like, yeah, bro. But like, it's awesome. Anyway, Francois is going to come up. He's going to set up his laptop. And when we make sure there's no technical difficulties, I'll hand off. He's going to talk to us about Nuqs, which is type-safe URL params. Who's using URL params? Yeah, look, all of you. Who's using Nuqs from that cohort? It's like 6. So you're going to get an upgrade because you're going to get type-safe URL params. You ready? Give it up, everyone. Francois, Best.
Check, 1, 2. Check. Yep. Wow, it's interesting being on stage. Last year, the first edition of React Paris was my first time attending a big conference like this. And to be on stage 1 year later, this is just amazing. Thank you, BJS, for organizing these kinds of conferences. All right, so we're going to talk about type-safe URL state management with a little library that I made called Nuqs. Tejas is already a show of hands for who uses it. I just want to know who heard about it before today in the audience. That's a few people. That's good. So hi, everyone. My name is François Best. I am a freelance software engineer from Grenoble in the French Alps. I've been using React since 2017, and I publish open source packages on NPM to solve problems both for myself and for my clients. And you can find me online at francoisbest.com. So today, we are talking about URL state. What is it exactly? It's the idea of storing structured data in the search params or query string, there's no consensus on what to call these, part of the URL. So everything after the question mark is a key value store that we can use to persist the state of our applications. So why would we want to do this? There is a wrong reason, at least wrong if that's the only reason you do this for. And that is reload resilience. So as David was showing, if you change some state and then you reload your page or you unmount your components, and that state is gone. Moving it into the URL would allow it to persist on reloads. But that is more of a side effect, and there are other solutions to do this, like local storage, for example. The real reason why you want to put state in the URL is because it gives your applications 2 superpowers. The first one is teleportation. By sharing a link with someone else, you teleport the memory representation of that state from your browser into theirs, allowing them to pick up where you left off and to see the same thing as you. This is what we usually call deep linking. The second superpower is time travel. Bookmarking is a way to share a link with yourself in the future. And if you use your browser history, you can recall state from the past. But you can also push state updates onto the browser history stack and use the back-forward browser buttons as an undo-redo feature. I'm not going to say for free. There are some caveats that we will talk about later. But you can time travel debug your state updates, a bit like the Redux DevTools, if you remember that. And that's pretty cool. Now, there's another interesting property of the URL that we can look at. With our frameworks going more towards server-side rendering as a first-class citizen, like server components, we can see the URL as the definition of the boundary between the client and the server. And so it becomes this natural place where we can share data between them. The client can attach state to the current URL for the page that it is on, and the server, in the server-side rendering part, can access that state, use it for data fetching, for rendering, and returning custom content. But the server can also reply using that system. Using a redirect, it can tell us, go there and attach that particular piece of state that is relevant for you, for your client, for your front end, to render with. So we have this bidirectional communications link between the client and the server using only the URL. No APIs, no network request, nothing. Just the current page that we're on. Now, as I said, there are some drawbacks to this process. So I don't want this talk to sound too much like a sales pitch for any particular solution, so I would like to focus on 5 things to watch out for that you can go home with and think about when you're implementing URL state in your applications. The first one is that the URL has a size limit, just like local storage or cookies. Around 2,000 characters is generally considered the safe limit, though that number comes from the days of Internet Explorer. May it finally rest in peace. The actual HTTP spec gives us a bit more headroom at about 8 kilobytes, but the practical limitations you will find will come from the way you share links with others. Technical limitations, like the transport you use. For example, if you want to send a big link on Signal or WhatsApp, it will either not make it clickable or just truncate it or fail to send the message. Social media might have URL shorteners that could help with this, but these also have limits to what they accept as a valid URL. There is a limitation, not only technical, but social one as well. The trustworthiness of our links. For example, between these 2 links, which are semantically equivalent, they both represent a 10-stack table state, which one would you rather click on? Yeah, the first one contains a lot of URL-encoded JSON, some base64, even for the demo. The second one is much shorter, so it fits our criteria, but it is also readable. You can read it and understand directly what is going to happen. It's a bit like a user interface, if you think about it. And that's because it's exactly what it is. The URL, sorry, is the first piece of UI that your users will see, even before they land on your application. So you want to design it as such. You want to make a good first impression because more clicks equals more conversions, right? Right, so now we have URLs. We've sent them out in the wild, we shared them. And here comes our second problem. Those URLs are immutable. But our application is not. It will evolve through time. It will change. We will introduce changes. And we still want to honor these old links that we've shared. Because cool URIs don't change by Tim Berners-Lee. And so the problem that we have is essentially that we have shared immutable databases out in the wild, and we now need to run schema migrations on all these old schemas. And how do we do this for URLs? Well, first we need to capture them, so we can use middleware to do this. Now that React Router supports middleware, experimentally still, but it allows you to do this pretty much everywhere. And then we can massage the old state into the current schema that our application expects, and pass that into redirect so that our application can handle it. Now, for our third point, let's use our time travel superpowers and go back to when I was talking about undo redo. Yeah, there is something that you can do when you push state updates onto the history stack rather than replacing it. Something bad. And that is breaking the back button. Sorry for reusing the slide from earlier. Yeah, people hate when you break the basic interactions that you can have with a browser because it breaks that contract. And that comes from pushing state updates that don't feel like navigation events. So you need to vibe check that one to make sure that the state updates that you push into URL are actually feeling like navigations. Now, as we're talking about URL updates, that brings us to our fourth point. There is something that's not really well known, is that browsers will rate limit state updates. If you call those APIs too fast, they will throw an error, potentially crashing your app in the process. That's for security reasons. Not crashing your app, the error. For example, Chrome and Firefox give you about 50 milliseconds or more to call these state updates. But Safari has much higher limits, which you can hit if you were to connect, for example, a search input directly into the URL by every keystroke sending an update. Nuqs solves this internally using a throttle queue, but this is something to keep in mind. Now you're going to applaud because I'm going to drink some water. Thank you. And so the last point that I want to cover is SEO. It's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot in your rankings by adding too much state in the URL, because search engine crawlers like the Googlebot will be very happy at finding all the variants of your URL and marking them as duplicates because it doesn't know which one is the correct one to index. An example for this is the YouTube watch page. There is technically only one page on YouTube for every single video out there, /watch. And the video ID is encoded in the v search param. But it also accepts other search params, like t to start the video at a particular point in time. And those two search params, v and t, don't carry the same weight. You definitely want to index the video ID, but nothing else, really. And so you do so using the canonical representation of your URL by passing it either via a link tag in the head of your HTML, or a response header from your server, or a sitemap file. Our frameworks have APIs to do this for us. So now I hope I haven't scared you off too much of the concept of URL state. And so let's actually have a look at what belongs in there. There is this diagram by Corey House. I'll have a link to the slides if you want to see a bigger version. But it lists all the state management libraries that we know and love, things like Tanstack Query for server state, things like useState and Jotai for global state. Xstate is actually mentioned 3 times in here, so that makes 3 state machines. Should we have David back on stage for that? No. So it actually starts at the top with, is it shareable via the URL? If yes, use the URL. And so that is the main property to think about, shareability. Does it make sense for you to, at any point in time, copy your URL, send it to someone, and should they see the same thing as you? So this gives us something to use the URL. But it doesn't really give us options like the other cases. So how do we do this? If we're lucky enough to be using one of the newest frameworks, Tanstack Router or Tanstack Start, they have solved this problem built in the framework. Because Tanner and his team have done an incredible job building great developer experience around search params and type-safe routes, etc. But what about the 99% of applications out there built on Next.js, on Remix, on React Router, on the traditional React single-page applications? Some of them might give us, as David was showing, a use search params hook, but it returns all the search params all at once and all as strings, which is not super scalable because our applications need other things than strings, numbers, dates, booleans, objects. And we want a strong bond between that data type and the key that is associated with it. And we also saw on David's talk that it was kind of hairy to stitch those things together when it's time to update the URL. And so I had this problem mainly for Next.js, and I kept reusing that hook, and I eventually put it on NPM. Some other people used it, started contributing to it, and it became the project known as Nuqs. Nuqs is a type-safe search params state manager for React. Type-safe because it does the translation between the query string and the data types your application needs, and it does so by strongly binding it to the keys. Search params because the storage is the URL. State manager because you would use it the same way you would useState or any global state manager. You move those hooks that consume it as far down the React tree as you need, and it lifts the state out for you into the URL. And for React, because it works with multiple React frameworks. And so we're going to do a little demo of how it works with Next.js and React Router v7. Remix 3, I guess we can call it too. There we go. Oops. There we go. So now, let me put this here. There we go. So on the left, I have a browser running a Next.js application on port 3000, and in another tab, I have the same application running with React Router v7. Let's put React Router in light mode so we can see which is which better. They both render the same shared component, the basic example of state management, a count button. So increase the count, reload the page, it resets. How do we move that state into the URL? I've already preset these two applications with Nuqs, and I will show what it involves in a bit. But it is very simple. We're going to say bye-bye to useState again and replace it with useQueryState from Nuqs. Now, the first argument is not going to be a number. It's going to be the name of the key that we want to use in the URL. So we'll call it count. And one thing to note is that the signature on the left has not changed. It is API compatible with useState. But our state type is now different. It's string or null. It is null if there is nothing in the URL, and by default, everything is a string. So we need to tell Nuqs that we are working with a number here. We do so using parsers. Parse as integer. So we have a lot of built-in parsers for lots of data types in Nuqs. And now my data type is number or null. This null is annoying because it screws up our logic here. So we're going to make it non-nullable by giving it a default value. With default, pass it 0. And now, if I save this, I can rename this for the account, URL state. And if I click my button, the state now lives in the URL. And I can copy this, move it here, change the port. And now I have teleported my state from one app to another. And that's all you need. Thank you. Now, you might be wondering, how does this work? Because there is nothing specific about Next or React Router in this component, and it is shared between the two. How does it work? The only requirement you need is to tell Nuqs about your framework. So here, for example, we are in Next.js. So we're going to go to the root layout. And we tell Next about this Nuqs adapter that is tailored specifically for the Next.js app router. And it will tell Nuqs how to read from the URL and how to update it based on your framework. Now, there is one more thing that I want to show you. That's what's happening in the network tab. If I click this button, or rather what's not happening in the network tab. If I click this button, you'll see that the URL updates, but there is no network request being made. And why is that? Well, if we think about it, this is a client component. That state only exists in the client. There is no real reason to send a network request to the server. But if we go back to our, to our presentation, there are actually two ways to update the URL. The first one is given by the frameworks through the router, and that generally sends a network request to the loader in React Router or to rendering the server tree in React. So it generates a network request. But there is another API, the history API, built into the browser. And this one only updates the URL client side. This is what we call shallow routing, and this is what Nuqs uses by default. So what happens when you actually want to do server-side rendering and you need those search params to go across this URL boundary? Let's actually have a look at what it looks like. So we're going to go back to a demo. And I actually started my career before doing web dev in the music industry. So we are going to look at a list of albums that we are going to filter. So we have albums here, that's cool. Let's add some filters to that. So I'm going to open this route in React Router. Quick 101, the loader function runs on the backend, fetches data from the database, passes it to our main component, which is our page component, which renders our view. So we're going to start by adding some filters here. Filters. There we go. So we have a search input, a number input to match the year of release for our albums, and a clear button that will remove it from the database. Cool. So how do we use URL state for this? Nuqs uses a declarative approach to search params. So in a different file, we're going to start by describing what we need. The keys will be the keys in the URL, so we're going to call it this one query. And the types will be the state types that we want, so using the parsers that we had earlier. So this one will be a string, parse as string. And I'm just going to import that from Nuqs server so that Next.js doesn't yell at me. Question of use client directives. And I'm going to define a default value for this one with default empty string. And we also have a release year, which is going to be a parse as integer. We're not going to define a default value for this one because the default year doesn't really make sense. We want them all if we have not specified a filter. And so now what we have is a descriptor object that we can reuse pretty much everywhere. There are two places where we're going to need it. The first one is on the server to do server-side rendering. And the second one is in our UI to connect to our input. So let's start with the server. We're going to create what we call a loader as well in Nuqs, which does this parsing for us. So const load filters equals create loader. And we pass it this search params object here. And nothing else. Thank you, Copilot. Export this, and we can use that in our React router loader to parse the search params that come in when a request arrives. So load filters. Thank you. And I can pass it the request directly. It will figure out how to go get the search params from that request object. And it returns an object where we have type-safe values. So query, release year. Query is a string. We had a default value, so it's not nullable. Release year is number or null. We can pass that to our database. Query release year. Thank you. And so now I haven't connected my UI yet, but I can actually use the URL bar as an input. And so we are in Paris, la ville de l'amour, the city of love. So let's look for albums about love. And there we go. Cool. So now let's connect our UI to do this. We are going to reuse that descriptor object again. We're going to pass it to useQueryStates, this time, plural, which works with objects. One day we might have a unified API for this. Filters search params without the U, and import from here. There we go. And the return value is the same value and function to change it. Value this time being an object, query and release here. And function to change it, we'll call it set search params. And now I can uncomment my inputs to connect it. So notice already how when we set the values, we set them one at a time, and Nuqs will do the stitching for us. But if I connect this, you see that we already have the state populated from the URL. The URL is the source of truth. And so now, if you remember what I said about the button, you will notice that if I type here, nothing happens on the server, because we need to opt out of this client-first approach. We do so with this shallow false option. And so now I should be able to go for love 1967 ahead of you. And I have a query that matches. Cool. Let's do the same thing in Next.js now. In Next.js, we have this page component that accepts as a prop a search params prop, which is a promise in Next 15 of type search params from Nuqs. This is a helper that we define because you'll see that the type that is expected by Next is kind of hairy, like record of string or string array or undefined. That's annoying to type every time, so we have this shorthand. And by accepting that prop as a page prop, it tells Next that this page is ready for server-side rendering. And so we can reuse our loader again, load filters. We can pass this promise, search params. And so we could await it here, or we could also await the result. If you pass a promise to a loader, it will return a promise to the past values. So let's do that here. And we can extract, destructure those values, and pass them to our database, the same way we did for React Router. Let's add our, if I switch that to next, that'll be good. Let's add our filters. Our filters are client components, so we need to wrap that in suspense. Suspense. And filters. Cool. And so now if I go copy that query here and paste it here, I see that I have both my UI and my data that have been in sync. Cool. Now, there is a little issue with this, the way we did this. We have this release here, this query values in the URL. These are variable names that make sense for our application. These are for developers. But remember what we said about UI. We want potentially to have customization on how the URL looks. And so Nuqs can do this by remapping keys from one name to another, from a name that makes sense for our business logic to a name that looks good in the URL. So we're going to do this again declaratively using export const filters URL keys. We're going to type this as URL keys and strongly bind it to the type of our search params. I'm vibe coding here, it's nice. And what we're going, oh yeah, I need to import that. So vibe coding doesn't always work, you see. And so here we have a strong type safety between the keys that we have, the variable names, sorry, that we have earlier, and we can do this mapping by giving it a shorter name. Now we need to tell Nuqs about this mapping. And so we do this in every place that we consume these things, so the loader and the useQueryStates. So we have URL keys, and we pass it this mapping. Now we have the same thing to do in our filters. URL keys, filters, URL keys. Cool. And so now, there is something interesting. I haven't implemented the clear button yet, but that's on purpose, because I introduced a breaking change in my application. I renamed the keys. So if I were to go and implement that right now, on click, I could do it this way. I could set each value independently to their default value. But remember what we said about null? Null means not in the URL. So we can have this shorthand here and just set our state to null. And that would clear it if it wasn't for the fact that now I have connected my button to the shorthands. So this is no longer connected. So if I go here and search again for love 1967, now we see that we have these shorthands in the URL and our button works. But we have, by introducing a breaking change, by renaming things, we now have to handle it as well for the old links that we had. It's not just about sharing it with others, it's sharing it literally with your old browser history. Okay, so now that we have that, I've been searching for albums about love from '67. That's the year that I have the most matches for in the database. And let's actually have a preset for this. How do we quickly link to it, for example? And so we can do this, I spoiled it, with a link. We can add a, thank you, a href. And what do we do here? Yeah, that works when it doesn't work. Never mind. Albums about love from 1967. Cool. So what do we do in here? We could do that, but we want type safety in our links as well. So if we think about it, the concept is the opposite of the loader. We want to generate a URL from a set of states. So this we call the serializer in Nuqs. Export const serialize filters equals create serializer. Serializer, thank you. And again, we pass it the descriptor object and the remapping that you will need to do to write that thing. And now I can go here and call this function, serialize filters. And here I can pass it, thank you, already the variable names that I need in my application. And I have this link here. If I click it, it presets my URL with everything. Cool. All right. There is one thing that I want to show you as well. I said earlier that useQueryState is only bound to these two search params. What does that mean? Let's have a look at what happens if I insert foo equals bar in the middle. And if I click the button, it keeps foo equals bar in the middle. It just removes those two state search params that it manages from the URL. So Nuqs will do all this stitching for you. Right, and now we have type-safe URL search params for everyone. Nice. Let's do a recap. So we saw that Nuqs uses a declarative approach to search params management. It is not particularly opinionated to where you declare those things. You could do it either near the components where you use it, or you could do it near the page where you consume the loaders, for example, or you could put it in a shared file in between and split that across your logic, your business logic. And it composes both by isolating those hooks, just the search params that they work with, and by stitching it together for you without having to do that, the same logic that we saw that David showed us. And so there is a lot of other things that we don't really have time to talk about. Things like custom parsers, which allow you to transform custom data types into beautiful representations in the URL, so you can create your own. Custom adapters to make it work in other frameworks. We have community-based adapters for Waku by Daishi Kato, and for Inertia to talk to PHP. And there is one in the works that I'm really interested in. It's to work with Expo Router for deep linking in React Native. And that one will be nice when it lands. just have to figure out some ESM issues. Use transition would allow you to have a loading state for when the server is doing server-side rendering. RSC cache is a way to do some kind of server-side context replacement in the React Server components, so not prop drilling those search params if you need to access them in a nested React Server components to do data fetching, for example. Validation with Zod and everything, and testing to avoid mocking your browser and your framework when you need to just test that the behaviors of updating the URL. And so if you want to learn more about all of this, I invite you to check out this QR code, which contains first the link to the channel on Discord for the questions and feedback, please. And also links to the slides, the docs, the repository, a star would be welcome, thank you, and how to find me on social media. And with this, I say thank you.